Hello, friends. I'm doing this new project at the suggestion of a friend, and because the bottom line is I'm called to preach, and there are minimal opportunities open to me at the moment. Doesn't change the fact this is a thing that I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm decent at it. So I've prayerfully decided that I'm going to start a series on the book of Hebrews. So before I get into the actual words, the scripture in the book of Hebrews, I feel like I needed to do an intro because it's my style is to always give you some context before I start talking about the things that the words say. So, any conversation that we begin about the book of Hebrews has to start with who was this book written to and why was it written to those people? The book of Hebrews is written to definitely to Jewish Christians, most likely in Jerusalem. The reason why it was written to them is because the Christian Jews were experiencing horrific persecution by Rome, and many of them had begun to turn away from the faith. And so the question needed to be answered, questions needed to be answered concerning why should I stick with this? You have to understand some things about the Jewish religion too. The Jewish religion had tradition, for thousands of years of tradition prior to the appearance of Christ on the scene. What I like to do, you grab, most Bibles have a page between the Old and the New Testament, one single blank page in between the two. And I've grown fond of grabbing hold of that page and having other people when I'm preaching pinch that page. That's 400 years that page represents between the end of the Old Testament and when Jesus first appears. There was 400 years, so there was no new revelation from God. And so then here comes Jesus and just turns the Jewish religion and basically the world upside down. So there's still thousands of years of tradition to contend with. There is the idea of temple life. Temple, you as a young Jewish person, you went to school in the temple. Court, if there was court was held in the temple. Religious services were held in the temple. And then here comes Jesus in the maturity of his ministry, miles away from any temple, forgiving people and healing and doing these kinds of things. It was contentious. An idea that also has to be contended with at the appearance of Christ and the idea of Christianity is that if you think of the Old Testament law as the law library, and essentially what God has done through Jesus is close the door on the law library. Now, it doesn't mean that we disregard the Ten Commandments and the things that the Old Testament present to us. There are the law, basically in the law library, Old Testament law library breaks down into two components. It's the do these things and don't do these things. The don't do these things basically are there to present to us the idea that we are going to live and navigate differently from how the world operates. For example, if the world teaches that you climb over top of people to get where you need to be in life, and the scriptures teaches that you become a servant to all people. There's real contrast in the way that the world basically teaches give in to your desires. The scripture says you need to keep those desires in check because in not keeping them in check drags you into places of sin and darkness. It is counter to many of the things that the world says and does and teaches and how it operates. And so those do not do these things laws are meant as a kind of an illustrative thing to let us see that we are supposed to be navigating differently in the world. Then there's the do these things, basically talking about the sacrifices that were required and why those sacrifices were required. And those things are all meant to point to Christ as the ultimate sacrifice for us. Here's how the system works. And then in contrasted with when Jesus comes for, he became the ultimate sacrifice for us. Therefore, when we go to church, we don't have to sacrifice cows, chickens, or pigs. It's not a blood pit outside your church now. You just go. And that through the Old Testament, God was mainly external. For example, the burning bush and the pillar of fire and the wandering cloud that led the Hebrews out of Egypt. Through Christ, the law is in us now. There's a few places later on as we get into the book of Hebrews where we're under the old school master and promises that the new covenant is based on better promises and the old covenant is now passing away. Those things I'll cover when I cover that chapter in Hebrews. But the idea being, the difficult thing is these traditions and these thousands of years of stuff suddenly don't matter. You don't have to keep the laws. You don't have to be sacrificed. You don't have to do sacrifices. You don't have to be circumcised. And the Jewish religion enjoyed the protection of Rome. So if you separated yourself from the Jewish herd and became a Christian person, you were open to bitter persecution. And listen, Rome were brutal punishers of people. There's a passage in 7 and subsequently 8 where Paul talks about, as many of you may be familiar with if you've been in church, where he talks about the good things that I want to do, I can't do those things, but the bad things that I don't want to do, why do I keep doing these things? And he says at the end of that passage, who will deliver me from this body of death? There's an idea I read somewhere that one of the capital punishments that Rome employed was that if you murdered a person, they would lay you down in this metal cage, right, about the size and shape of your body, and take your victim and lay your victim face down on top of you and shut that cage. And your punishment was that person that you murdered's body decomposing right on top of you face to face. Who indeed will deliver me from this body of death? I think about like a grilled cheese sandwich. When you peel apart the grilled cheese and the cheese strings out, ooh, just how do you ever lay down and sleep again? So there's some reasons for why people, it was so ingrained in them, and Paul's ministry to the Gentiles, the people that were not Jewish. And there was a group called the Judaizers who were insisting that it wasn't enough that you said a prayer and asked Christ into your heart. You also had to be circumcised and you had to observe the Jewish laws, to which Paul emphatically says no. His primary teaching was salvation by grace through faith. It's just enough to ask for it. It's all that's required. So it would be difficult for those first century Christians to be persecuted and dragged out of church and physically punished for what they were doing. And so many of them began to turn back to the Jewish religion because it's not worth it. And so this book is written to those people to explain to them that there's a better way. And so you're going to find as we move through the book of Hebrews, this will of course be the introductory part 1, all kinds of Old Testament quotes. And I'll try to, the best that I can, get into why those quotes are there and what they're meant to represent. And in a case here is going to be made in the book of Hebrews. A case is going to be made to say, listen, this persecution that you're going through is lasting for a very short time, but this is an eternally important issue that we're dealing with. There may also be opportunity for people who say, is Jesus the only way? And why is Jesus the only way? And if you just have a sincere heart, doesn't matter what you do and how you worship God. I've taken to saying that while there is only one way, biblically there's only one way through salvation, and that is through Jesus Christ. But I think people make that way, the way, Jesus, way more narrow. Although the scriptures does say that the way to eternity is narrow and the way to death and destruction is wide, like 270 versus an alley. But within that way, I think people make, there is some individuality built into your relationship with Christ because we are diverse as human beings, each of us bringing different cultures and background to that relationship. And it just makes sense to me that it's not as narrow as people make it. There is only one way to God through Christ, but within that way, there's some wiggle room. Okay, I imagine I'll unpack some of that as we get through the rest of the book of Hebrews and as this unpacks itself. I need to talk briefly about the idea of suppressionism, which the doctrine of suppressionism, which I believe firmly, which simply states this, is that the church takes the place of Israel as God's people. Israel, which I know is going to, especially as heated as things are right now, I believe there's biblical support for this. It doesn't make sense to me that if Christianity was meant to spread to everyone throughout the world, before Christ comes, at least everyone will have had the opportunity to hear the gospel. And asking Christ into your heart, literally, in believing that the change has taken place, accepting Christ into your heart, makes us children of Abraham. Abraham believed God, and that was credited to him as righteousness. So literally, then that he becomes the father of the faith for us, and it's the same for us. And so suppressionism simply states that the church takes the place of Israel as God's people. I will also thematically try to put in places for that as we move through. Last thing to talk about introductorily, in an introductory sense, is the idea of authorship. For a long time, authorship of the book of Hebrews was credited to Paul. It would make sense. Paul makes sense as an author for the book of Hebrews because his letters to the church kind of illustrate the problems he was having with these issues and why people kept turning away from the faith, and these Judaizers came and started to, a good place to really get a grip on that is the book of Galatians, where these people that came and were insisting to put that Old Testament weight on New Testament Christians. So Paul made sense as an author, but as time and scholarly debate has built concerning the book of Hebrews, there's been some other suggestions that pop up. One of those is that this was a student of Paul. The primary reason why there's any question at all that this was written by Paul is because we have other writings. Understand that 3/4 of the New Testament is merely, we read those as books, but those are letters that Paul wrote to these churches as he went and started them on his missionary journeys. It is speculated that Paul's missionary journeys in the major cities that he stopped in the direction that he stopped in them, was that it was the known mail route at the time. So it would make sense, that's smart. These are the major cities that the mail route stops through, so let me go through these places and start churches at every one. But we have those letters from Paul, and the wording, subtleties in the wording of the book of Hebrews causes scholars to go, I'm not sure if that's Paul or not. Some things are expanded upon, possibly that only a continuance of thought as this ministry began to unfold, as people began to understand things more about the relationship of the Old Testament to Christianity. And so the wording is different in the book of Hebrews from what it is in the other letters that we have from Paul to measure them against. Another possibility that people have put out there is that maybe that it was Luke. You understand that Luke is the author of the book of Luke, also the book of Acts. I would suggest a book called Paul on Trial, which posits the idea that both of those books are written to a guy named Theophilus. And it is believed that this was written, the book of Luke and the book of Acts was written by Luke as a defense for Christians who were in trial for being Christians. And so that book even lists like certain scriptures and what charges might have been leveled against the Christians at the day and time that this stuff was written. So it would be possible as a continuance to the book of Luke and the book of Acts, kind of an additional supplementary thing to add to that for Jewish Christians to kind of give treatment to the relationship of the Old Testament to Christianity for those people. A few other people suggested, one that stuck out to me was Clement, the Bishop of Rome, and someone like him who many years after, so you have Jesus and you have his 12 guys. And then Jesus goes on and ascends, and those guys, the guys who were firsthand with Jesus, were considered the fathers or the originators. And so the council in Jerusalem, and any questions as far as early on at the very beginning of all this, immediately after Jesus' ascension, those guys were turned to heavily for, hey, how are we supposed to do this? How does this look? And a little bit after that comes Paul, then those guys begin to die off, and you have what's called the apostolic fathers. These are the people that were one step Jesus, then the guys who immediately knew Jesus, and then the guys who studied under the guys who immediately knew Jesus, or the apostolic fathers. And so you have brilliant-minded people in different regions as the gospel began to spread out throughout the world, that it's possible that one of these guys took on authorship of the book of Hebrews for the same purpose. Because people begin to turn away because once you became a Christian, the protection of Rome and all the things I previously mentioned. Another one that I wanted to mention that in my kind of researching to try to put this together is Priscilla, a person who Paul had contact with. It's an interesting thing to consider, and a good reason why there is no author or a name of an author directly attributed to the book of Hebrews, because the way that females were seen and viewed at the time, it's a good possibility that if she was the author of this, why her name would have been removed. So these are all interesting things to consider as we're moving forward. So I'm going to conclude the introduction with that. Go back and just to say this was written to Jewish Christians who were turning away from the faith purely because of persecution. And they needed encouragement. Listen, why should I stick to this? And how can I know, in spite of years of Jewish tradition and God's movement through God's people and all these things, why? How can I know and be sure? And as we unpack the material in the book of Hebrews, that case is going to be made. Old Testament scriptures are going to be brought up to prove that, yes, as far as God and Christianity is concerned, Christianity is the ultimate completion of the Old Testament relationship to God. We are, it's a weird way of saying this, but you might say in a way, we are completed Jews. I'm going to say this in closing. As I move forward through this, listen, don't take my word for any of this. I mean, you research these things for yourself. Get in the Word for yourself. I had the unfortunate situation here recently where I had to preach a funeral for another friend who was taken from me by addiction. And in preparation for the sermon for that funeral, I sat down and was just trying to, think of a passage to use for that. And it's been a while. I mean, I pray every day, but I don't really haven't been getting in the Bible as much as I should. And in a weird moment, I kind of realized that God can only speak to you with His Word, the Bible, no other way. So if you're not reading your Bible and not putting those words in you, God simply can't speak to you. And it was in that depths of that moment that caused me to realize that I need more of this in me. So doing these sermons for you also helps me, because aside from my devotional time I'm actually, from my own personal time, I'm reading out of the book of Jeremiah. That's why I decided to do something different, because I don't want to tandem or be lazy and put my devotional time stuff that I'm reading for me out there for everybody else, because then it's not for me. So I kind of prayerfully thought about where was a good place to jump from, and I've never done really a deep dive on the book of Hebrews, and so it felt like a good place to start. So this is meant to help you. It's also meant to help me. So that concludes part one, an introduction to the book of Hebrews. I will begin then. The next part of this will be part two, and I'll probably do these a chapter at a time as a way that makes sense to me, unless the content breaks up even further than that. My intent is to do one sermon per chapter, or one post per chapter. I would encourage you to visit www.ttwmtruth.com. There's many other resources and things there. I will also post these videos on there as well. And I always close by saying the same thing. If nobody has told you they love you today, I love you. Hope you're at peace and prospering. If not, we'll try again tomorrow. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. I mean it.